Good evening. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the William G. McGowan Theater this evening, and a special welcome to those of you who are joining us on our YouTube channel. Tonight, we'll be hearing from the renowned historian Eric Foner and his distinguished colleagues as they discuss the promise and perils of the Underground Railroad for those fleeing slavery in the mid-19th century. Professor Foner will remain after the program to sign copies of his book, Gateway to Freedom, The Hidden History of the Underground Railroad. Before we begin tonight's program, I'd like to tell you about two programs we'll be presenting here in the next couple of weeks. On Thursday, February 5th at 7 p.m., we'll host a forum on the Rosenberg case. Journalist Marvin Kalb will lead a panel discussion on the espionage case of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. And on next Thursday, February 12th at 7 p.m., come enjoy a concert by the Airmen of Note, the premier jazz ensemble of the United States Air Force. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events in print or online. There are copies in the lobby, as well as sign-up sheets where you can receive it by regular mail or email. You'll also find brochures about other National Archives programs and activities. And another way to get more involved with the National Archives is to become a member of the Foundation for the National Archives. The Foundation supports all of our education and outreach activities, and there are applications for membership in the lobby. Our subject tonight, Eric Foner's latest work, Gateway to Freedom, has earned much praise from its reviewers. The Washington Post Review said in his carefully argued new book, Eric Foner aims to set the record straight. Drawing on his deep expertise in the history of abolitionism, Foner demonstrates that one cannot understand the origins of the American Civil War without taking into account the resistance and activism of fugitive slaves and their anti-slavery allies. And from the Los Angeles Times, intellectually probing and emotionally resonant, Gateway to Freedom reminds us that history can be as stirring as the most gripping fiction. As many of us have already discovered on our own, history is indeed as stirring as the most gripping fiction. Every day here at the National Archives, researchers make discoveries and piece together previously unknown stories. Records such as the petitions and claims help us cross the divide of a century and more, and allows us to hear the voices of those who have been held in bondage. Tonight, we'll hear the stories of self-emancipated slaves as told in Professor Foner's book. So let's welcome tonight's moderator, Ed Ayers, president of the University of Richmond, and our panelists, Eric Foner, professor of history at Columbia University and author of Gateway to Freedom, Edna Greene Medford, professor of history at Howard University, and Adam Rothman, associate professor of history at Georgetown University. Please welcome our panel.
Well, good evening, everybody. I'm Ed Ayers. I'm the moderator, which means I get to cause trouble for everybody, and I'm looking forward to doing that. And I want to begin with this question that I wrote. So, was there really an Underground Railroad?
If I may.
And so you should know what the rules are. Professor Foner may not answer a question until both our other panelists have had a chance to fully excoriate him and his book. Then he can offer a weak rejoinder of some sort. Yes, Edna.
Was there an Underground Railroad? It depends upon how you define Underground Railroad. If you think it was a single system of safe houses from the south to the north, then no, it didn't exist. But as Professor Foner has indicated, it was a network of organizations, vigilance committees, anti-slavery societies, individuals, community groups, and they're talking to each other, but there's no one single organization that's coordinating all of this.
Adam, you agree with that? Is that coherent enough to be called an Underground Railroad?
I think it is. I like the idea of an Underground Railroad. It's a fantastic, impossible image of a railroad running underground. Underground Railroad, neither underground nor a railroad. Discuss.
Right.
But if you just think about the variety of ways that enslaved people escaped from slavery, made their way to places like Philadelphia and New York and Albany and ultimately to Canada, they found a way. Some of them walked, some of them rode in wagons, some of them sailed, some of them hid away in steamships, some of them literally mailed themselves to freedom. Just such an astonishing variety of modes of escape, I think, is actually successfully captured by that Underground Railroad idea.
So the question's not over, so you may not speak yet.
Yeah.
So here's what I want to know. Why did we doubt that there was for quite a stretch? I mean, the most influential book by a historian for decades said, oh, come on, it's a myth. Why would we doubt this? You offered compelling portrayals of it. Okay,
Yeah,
you
but
can't
no,
wait any
well,
longer.
Champing at the
Let the record show.
I
98
think that
seconds.
I think that Larry Garrett, the book that you're referring to, The Liberty Line, was reacting against a kind of a exaggerated image, which Edna, we're talking about, that, there was fixed routes, stations, agents, passwords, secret codes. This goes all the way back to books from the late 19th century. Wilbur Siebert, who actually had maps purporting to show all of these fixed routes. It wasn't really like that at all. Garrett came along and said, no, this is all tremendously exaggerated. But also, he said, the image a lot of people had of the Underground Railroad was basically of humanitarian whites helping downtrodden slaves. And the initiative of the fugitives themselves kind of got lost in the shuffle. As Adam said, people escaped from slavery using all sorts of ingenious methods and all sorts of varieties of ways of getting out. But somehow in the old picture, it was the white station masters who were the heroes. So Garrett said, forget about that. There was no such system. But I think, as most revisionists maybe tend to do, he went overboard and threw out the whole idea, whereas he did point out some of the exaggerations. But, so for a long time, you're right, historians kind of doubted that any kind of network like that existed at all.
And was there something about 1961 that would lead Garrett to think that, whereas now we're more inclined to see a pattern?
I'm the only one here who was around in '61, so well, first of all,
it was black and white back then, wasn't it?
Garrett wrote, obviously the civil rights movement was reaching its height at that point in the early 60s. The sit-ins had just begun in 1960. Black militancy was very much in the news and in the streets. And so his emphasis on the initiative of African Americans themselves fit very well with the tenor of the times.
So are we inclined now to see a pattern or a consistency where people might not have been before?
Well, I think so. It was easy then to believe that African Americans couldn't do very much on their own, and that there had to be good white men from the North and in the South who are sort of ushering them to freedom. And the reality is that African Americans are starting out in many instances on their own. They do get help along the way, of course, and they get tremendous amounts of help once they get to the North. But a lot of the people who are helping them even then are other African Americans. Individuals, whole neighborhoods of people, actually. I was struck in Professor Foner's book when I read the extent to which local communities get involved in making sure that people are not returned to slavery. Large numbers of people turn out and actually try to stop these people from being shipped back to the South. And so it's not just good abolitionists who are there standing between slavery and freedom, but there are many African Americans as well who are helping these people to freedom.
So, it's often pointed out, I don't know if you would agree with this number, that only 2% of white Northerners would have identified as abolitionists. And in the same way now that you're pointing out, there's this huge network of African Americans, free and enslaved, who North and South, who are helping their compatriots escape. Does Eric's portrayal, you think, of these allies that these African Americans had lead us to to think that maybe a 2% number of abolitionists understates the effect of the abolitionists, and that it's a bigger presence than we thought? Adam, you made the mistake of nodding, so I will.
Absolutely. It may or may not be true that 2% of white Northerners were abolitionists. They certainly were a small and beleaguered minority. But the effects of the abolitionist movement were tremendous. And I think especially the debates and scenes around the rescue and recapture of fugitive slaves. These are really spectacular events, and they're polarizing events in many northern towns and cities. And they force white Northerners who are not themselves abolitionists and who may not have themselves confronted the reality of slavery in their daily lives. They force those people to come face to face with the bloodhounds and the slave catchers that stood behind slavery. And it may not have convinced a majority of Northerners before the Civil War to immediately abolish slavery, but I do think that it sort of touched the chords of Northern conscience in ways that had very powerful and concrete political effects.
And when you think about the kinds of challenges they faced as abolitionists, especially when they're involved with the Fugitive Slave Act after 1850, they're going to jail. They're being fined. They're being ostracized by their neighbors when their neighbors know what they're doing. And so it's a tremendous personal sacrifice to them to be involved in attempting to end slavery, and especially to help fugitives from slavery. And so the average person is not going to risk all the way some of these people did. We have to remember that they're the bad guys during this period from the perspective of many people in their neighborhoods. They're the troublemakers. They get beaten up. It's just, it's a very difficult thing to be an abolitionist during this period.
But the thing is that there were, wherever that 2% number comes from, there were pockets of abolitionists. Those 2% were not spread evenly across the whole North, as you know. There were areas, and this is very connected to the Underground Railroad, southeastern Pennsylvania, where there were a lot of rural Quaker farming families. A lot of them were abolitionists, and if slaves got across the Mason-Dixon line, they could receive help there. Or upstate New York, where really abolitionism was much stronger than 2%, and a place like Syracuse, I write about, I mean, the Underground Railroad was totally open. One of the reasons it's not totally underground is in some places it was quite public. They had the head of the Underground Railroad in Syracuse, Jermaine Logan, himself a fugitive slave, advertised in the newspaper. He said, I'm the head of the Underground Railroad in this town. Anyone who comes across a fugitive slave, send him to my house. He raised money, he had fundraising parties. Nobody arrested him. I mean, that was a place where anti-slavery sentiment was strong enough that it was possible to be public. So there were these pockets, not a majority by any stretch of the imagination, but where fugitive slaves could receive assistance as they moved to eventually to Canada. After the 1850 law, only Canada would really offer you security.
So in the same way that the Underground Railroad only connects a relatively few places, you have really excellent maps and the wonderful book. But it's also the case that politics would also just focus on these few places. So rather than imagining them like peanut butter spread across the North, instead they're sort of concentrated in places where they end up having very large effect. Yes, Adam.
I just want to add, though, and this is one of the things that's so wonderful about Professor Foner's book, is that it really focuses on one of the places where you might not expect to find a thriving and significant.
Oh, Adam, how could that be? We all know that New York City is the capital of Yankeedom. How could
Liberalism,
of
right,
liberalism.
Right.
But it wasn't
No.
before the Civil War. New York City, as the key cotton port in the United States, had very close ties to the slave South. Democratic Party conceded to slavery, was very powerful in New York City. And New York City was really a pro-slavery bastion in the North. So it's one of the places where abolitionists would have found themselves under the most intense pressure And what Gateway to Freedom shows is how these few dedicated and courageous abolitionists in the heart of New York City managed to hustle hundreds of slaves towards freedom. And I think that's a remarkable achievement of historical analysis, to draw our attention to that place at that time.
Well, one of the things, I mean, thank you, Adam, but this goes back to your point. I estimate that at any one time, there were probably no more than a dozen people in New York City kind of working more or less full-time on helping fugitive slaves. So the abolitionist movement was pretty small. But then there were this anonymous, larger group, most of them African Americans. New York had a pretty thriving free black community. People who worked on the docks, people who worked in hotels, people who came into contact with fugitive slaves, and they knew where to send them. These are people, we don't even know their names mostly, but they knew, okay, if I come across a fugitive slave, I send him to this office, the anti-slavery office.
Like whoever Frederick Douglass ran into.
Yeah,
Right.
sent him to the Vigilance Committee,
Right.
right. So you have a tiny core of people working on this, and then you have a somewhat larger group around them who are just happy to help out a fugitive slave if they encounter them. They're not working on it, but if they encounter them, they know what to do.
So what would motivate people, as Edna says, to risk their lives in this kind of public way to be the bad guys? So, not you. You wrote a book about it. I'm just the other two.
I'm just, what motivates people anytime?
Well, I mean, because I do think one of the things about the book is it just shows you how risky it was to do this for black and white people to do it. So what do we think the motivations were?
Well, I think it's mixed. It depends upon the individual. There are some people who are doing it because they're caught up in this whole evangelical movement, this second great awakening, and this is all a part of that. It's sort of the tail end of that. There are others who believe that everyone has a right to what America says it stands for. Lincoln, for instance, is talking about hating slavery not just because of the moral issue, but because of what it does to the reputation of America. You know, it makes Americans look like hypocrites. So some people, I'm sure, are doing it for that reason. I think it depends upon the individual. I was struck as well by the fact that there are some people who are defending the fugitives who might not necessarily care very much about African Americans in general, but they are defending the fugitives. And so people are entering this struggle for a variety of reasons.
So help me understand something that I find students wonder about. It feels like the white hot part of the story is in the 1830s, which is a long time from the Civil War, right? And so does the abolitionist movement sort of peak in like a quasar, you know, sort of, and the 1840s and 50s are just sort of the trailing light from that? Or do we think that that was the beginning of something that gained momentum until it built to the Civil War? And it can only be one or the other of those. It can't be anything else.
You know, the abolitionist movement, I think, as you well know, it split in half in 1840. And it flowed,
right there in New York.
It flowed into different directions. I think the 1830s is the peak in the sense that that's the decade in which they forced the slavery issue into public debate. They shattered the conspiracy of silence on slavery. Then they themselves split, and it went in, so then the question of even defining what is an abolitionist becomes difficult. Some of them go into political activity. Some of them go into, you know, this more religious anti-slavery. By the 1850s, you have anti-slavery politics. They're not abolitionists, but they're, you know, people like Lincoln and William Seward and Chase and others who are in the mainstream of the political system. So the abolitionists have helped to create a public sentiment that makes anti-slavery politics possible. And so the question is, did they disappear, or did they really, in a sense, get almost superseded by a more moderate kind of hostility to slavery, which is what eventually brings on the Civil War?
Well, I'd be curious to know my fellow panelists' thoughts on this. Is anti-slavery politics of the Republican Party a dilution of the original radical impulse? Now, there's lots of things, even in Eric's book, in which you see them kind of, edging their bets.
Yeah.
Or is it, does the very fact that this continues into the 1850s a sign that it's a contagion of progress that's spreading? Do you have thoughts about that? Because I think people have a hard time understanding, well, if it was such a big deal, why is there, it seems to have actually been running out of steam in the 40s and 50s. I think one of the strengths of this book is it suggests that if you just think about abolitionism as abolitionism rather than its consequences. But I'd like to know how to answer my students, so if you folks can help me out, I'd appreciate it.
I think, first of all, we have to shake the image of abolitionism as exemplified by William Lloyd Garrison.
Right.
William Lloyd Garrison, in the way most people understand abolitionism, is the beginning and end of the abolitionist movement. And he defines its principles and its tactics. And he is, I think, really the leading light of abolitionism in the 1830s. But in the 1840s and 1850s, he, I think, ends up more on the margins of the movement. But that doesn't mean that abolitionism is dead or marginalized. It actually means that abolition has grown and moved in different directions and engaged different arenas of American society, including a political arena that actually strengthens abolitionism. There's one argument that the kinds of breaks and divides within abolitionism weaken the movement, but perhaps those breaks and divides and arguments and bitter debates actually strengthen the movement, actually move it in creative directions, generate new ideas, and force it to think more about tactics and strategy. How are we going to get the white northern majority to shift on this, to look at things from our point of view? So I think the diversity of abolitionism, especially in the 1850s, is a strength, not a weakness.
And so don't we also have to separate abolitionism from anti-slavery activity? Because it seems that what's happening by the 1850s at least, this pressure, this whole focus on anti-slavery, the expansion, the extension of slavery into the West, for instance, is what fuels the abolitionist movement, I think. Because certainly these folk who are anti-slavery are not truly abolitionists. They're more than happy to see slavery continue where it already exists. They just don't want it in the northern states, and they certainly don't want it in the West. But it seems that when the South presses that, then abolitionism becomes stronger, because Northerners realize that they're going to have to deal with the slavery issue.
So if we're trying to
beyond.
graph this, it's not a rise and decline, or in some ways, it is situational. Something can set this off, and it seems that each time it sets it off, there's more powder, right? Mm-hmm. It seems to be sort of a growing thing. And so I think one of the very interesting aspects the book is talking about, well, let me ask this question. Was the Fugitive Slave Act the defining event of the conflict between the North and the South?
I don't think there was one defining event.
No, there can only be one. You're not getting how this is working.
However, as you know, if you read South Carolina's Declaration of the Causes of Secession, which they issued in December 1860 when they severed their tie to the Union, the longest, it's a lot of complaints against the North, the longest one is about fugitive slaves. Even though not that many escaped from South Carolina, it was too far.
Right.
But the fugitive slave issue polarized North and South as much as any other issue. It wasn't the only one, but it was a major catalyst of the sectional crisis. That, I think it's fair to say that, because this is in the Constitution. But
I thought your book, that's what was cool about it, is you showed us that it was, precisely because it set off these kind of conflicts that Edna and Adam were talking about, that, obviously Uncle Tom's Cabin as well, but it seemed to be the thing.
Okay, I'll accept that.
He just graciously accepted that he was right. Kind of a hollow victory, Adam.
I would say that the Fugitive Slave Act is certainly the defining event for Black Northerners, because it really pulls the rug of freedom out from under them. It means that they were never fully safe in the northern states, which we mistakenly call the free states. But after 1850, it becomes even riskier for northern blacks who, especially those who were themselves fugitive slaves and were subject to be returned to slavery, but also for people who had been born free, who risked being kidnapped and falsely judged to be slaves, and basically re-enslaved and shipped south. So you find in the 1850s lots and lots of black northerners moving to Canada, which becomes really the land of freedom in the 1850s. And there's a memoir by a guy named William Still, an African-American, freeborn African-American, who was really he was the agent of the Underground Railroad in Philadelphia, and he sent a lot of fugitives to New York, and then they were sent up to Albany and eventually up to Canada. And there's a guy named John Henry Hill, who actually literally escaped from a slave auction at Richmond and made his way to Philadelphia and then to Canada, and then he wrote letters back to Still about life in Canada, and they're just amazingly fiery letters, contrasting Canadian freedom with American slavery. So I think that was a really important moment for black Northerners' own politics.
Then perhaps, I guess, if we can say that the Fugitive Slave Act itself was the defining moment for Northerners, then perhaps the lack of enforcement was a defining moment for Southerners. Because New Yorkers especially, some groups of them certainly, did not want to enforce it. The people didn't. Certainly the folk who were, the authorities were more than happy to comply. But there were local people who did not. And so I think it really did impact the way the South looked at things. It's about property rights versus human rights. And from a Southern perspective, you don't tread on my property rights. And I think they realized that as long as people were willing to defy that law, then they were not going to have their way with slavery.
The irony of wanting federal power against the rights of the states seems an interesting flip there, that they want it when it's useful to them.
Oh, yeah. Well, the fugitive slave law was probably the most vigorous kind of exercise of the power of the federal government within the United States. I'm not talking about wars with other countries, but internally, in the whole pre-Civil War period, it overrode all these laws that the northern states had passed to procedures for dealing with fugitive slaves. It made it a federal crime to try to obstruct the capture of a fugitive slave or even to refuse to assist. If a federal marshal comes up to you and says, hey, I'm going after that fugitive and you got to come and help me, and you say, no, I don't really think I want to do that, you're committing a federal crime. So the idea that Southerners were completely dedicated to states' rights is not accurate if you bring the fugitive slave law into the picture, because there it was the, as I say, vigorous use of federal power to enforce their claim to slave property, as you said.
So, Edna, you mentioned before that the people who are sometimes working on behalf of this are doing it because it's not really sympathy for African American people. I think one of the things that Eric's book shows is the remarkable range of relationships among black and white people at the time. If you'd like to talk about that, because I think, some people imagine that it's just every white person hates every black person, right? And others imagine that they're these abolitionists were free of racial prejudice. Yes. But then we see this story, and it seems all scrambled. What lessons would we draw about racial definition from this story?
Well, I was struck too by the fact that you've got fugitives coming into town or on the way, and they're staying in the homes of people who are more than willing to help them and risk all for them. I think it's very hard for us to say that race is, race is certainly clearly defined during this period, but people do things because they think it's the right thing to do, or because they think that, this is what America stands for, or whatever. It isn't a black or white, no pun intended, but it's it's each individual deciding what is right for them. And so you have someone like John Jay II, who is a lawyer, who is facilitating the freedom of these people. But if I'm recalling correctly, he was not someone who was terribly interested in the personal well-being of an African American, but someone who believed that these fugitives were entitled to legal support.
Or
Was
you have a
willing
guy
to give
like
it.
Louis Tappan, who is always overshadowed, as Adam said, by William Lloyd Garrison. In fact, one of the things that surprised me as I was working on this book is my opinion of Louis Tappan kept rising. He was, you know, even though they're fighting with Garrison, he was a very well-to-do merchant. He had a nice big house in Brooklyn Heights. Now, Tappan did not hire blacks in his own stores, and yet he hid them in his home. So what does that tell us about race? You know, it tells you that
Yeah, what does it tell us?
it tells us that people are complicated, which I think we all know from studying history, right? Tappan was a principled guy, but his egalitarianism went only so far, and yet he spent a lot of his own money on this. When people needed money, they went to Tappan, you know, because he had it. Or these Quakers. You know, they were principled anti-slavery, and yet in their own churches, they made blacks sit in the back. A lot of African Americans who wanted to become Quakers were very disgruntled at the way they were treated in Quaker meetings. So, you know, it's not a very simple thing just to say, is this person a racist or is not a racist? There's a wide range of behaviors and attitudes that people can have.
Adam, have you anything else you wanted to say about that?
Well, I just think that the issue in the United States before the Civil War was slavery.
Right.
And there were people who had a very low opinion there were white people who had very low opinion of black people, but who hated slavery because they thought it was a basic violation of natural rights, or they thought it was contrary to the Bible, or they thought it corrupted American institutions and should be abolished. But the question of what the status of black people should be in society once slavery was abolished, separate question.
Yeah, it's almost like it's complicated, Eric. So what I want to know is, you know, I want you to tell us about the central document in your book, which you do a good job of saving until near the end. You know, we keep looking forward to it. And I'm surprised because it suggests that there are still things in archives that we don't know about. I always quote my mom, who's a fifth grade teacher. I told her I was going to go to graduate school in history, and she said, well, what for, honey? We already know what happened. And which is a good line. And I think I get the feeling, too, that sometimes it feels like, and we've seen all the evidence now, and yet here's something that was kind of hidden pretty close to you that you should have found long ago, if I'm not mistaken.
Well,
so tell us the story about that.
Yeah, sure. But the other mistake we make, and Ed here is partly responsible for this, is the thought that everything is now online.
Yeah.
He is the pioneer, and in fact...
And I'm only up to 96% of having everything
Right.
online.
Ed is the pioneer of what they now call digital history, long before it even had a name, and deserves enormous credit for that. But there are still things out there that are not online and not been digitalized. And yes, here we are in a great archive, of course, and this particular document called the Record of Fugitives, which was a record kept by an abolitionist editor, Sidney Howard Gay, in New York City for 2 years, 1855-56. He just interviewed about over 200 fugitive slaves who passed through New York City. And as a journalist, he asked them about their experiences, their owners, how they escaped, why they escaped. He wrote it all down. It's an amazing document giving you the words of these people and their experiences right at the time. Yeah, it's in the Columbia Rare Books Library. It's not.
And aren't you a professor at Columbia?
Yeah, well,
And
I haven't
haven't
gone through every single thing there.
And you've been there a long time, have you not?
But I didn't know about this document, and it was. By the way, it also shows you that archives are only useful if they're cataloged or indexed.
Oh, it's the archive.
It's the archivist's problem. No, it's the president of the university.
That's always the
It's
case,
his fault. But but a student actually pointed it out to me and said she was working on a senior thesis having to do with his journalistic career. And she said, you know, in box 72, Professor, there's this thing, the Record of Fugitives, and you might find it interesting. I don't know what it is. And I went and looked at it, and it was fascinating. William Still kept some records like this, but Still was not this kind of journalist. His are a little more telegraphic. The stories in this are very rich and full. And, you know, and I had never heard of it. It had maybe only been cited once or twice by people. And that became the basis of this book. Or that is to say, I worked outward from it to try to figure out who are these slaves, who helped them. The names of people are in there. Who were these guys in Syracuse or Albany? They sent them to you. I began to try to work out these networks moving outward from this very, very remarkable document, which really I didn't know. And then, of course, like all historians, I started going backward, always looking to the roots. Well, where's, okay, 1830s, 1820s. Now it starts out in New Amsterdam, at least a paragraph, 1650s, but we don't have too much information back then. But it is a very remarkable human story with these individuals who mostly are lost to history now. We know they came through New York. You can track them often through digitalized stuff like the Canadian census of 1861. A good number of them, you can find them up there. So we know they reached Canada. But it's, you know, it's a remarkable human set of stories. And, right, so there's still surprises that you can discover in archives right under your nose.
So you've read his book based on this find. What do we still wish we knew about the Underground Railroad? We now know more about it than we ever did before from this node radiating. But what do you still wish we knew? Which is not a criticism of Eric, but
There's more to be said.
well, you never can tell if somebody find the right folder, right? But what do you wish you knew?
I think I would like to see something more detail about what happens from the moment the person leaves the farm or the plantation or the city, and just a real rich story of all of the things, all of the challenges along the way. And you deal with a lot of that, but I would like to hear more of that. I can, just from reading it, I can imagine someone spending the night or several days in a swamp. I would love to have an account day by day exactly what's happening, and we'll never have that.
I wonder if you could help our friends here understand kind of where the people who escaped slavery through this network came from, and what means would they use to start this process? Would you mind telling?
They're coming from, the ones that are going to New York are coming from Maryland and Virginia, primarily because it's easy, they're closer to free territory. Some are coming from as far away, though, as North Carolina.
Yes.
And maybe even further south,
Yeah.
but for the most part, it's Virginia, it's Maryland, especially the eastern shore of Maryland, the Baltimore area, and certain areas of Virginia. And they're coming by way of sea. They're on trains. They walk part of the way. The idea of people walking for 200 miles, women are doing it. Women with children are doing it. It's just amazing the kind of effort they put forward for freedom and all of the challenges that they're having along the way. People who never had ventured very far from their homes, and they strike out, and they do this. Sometimes they're doing it as individuals, especially young men are, but they're doing it in groups as well. And so I think the book is very, there are these very vivid stories of what's happening.
I was surprised about how long people in, say, a place like Norfolk could get away with being allies for people who would like to escape, you know, and so that they would be, it would be known that if you can make your way to this ship, this boat, that they will take you to Philadelphia.
It's amazing how, I mean, there were thousands of ships plying routes up and down the Atlantic coast, little ships, big ships. It was impossible to inspect all of them. And yes, there were sea captains. This goes back to our question of motivation. There were captains for money who they weren't abolitionists, but if you could pay, they would hide you in the bottom of their ship somewhere and drop you off in Philadelphia or something like that. And there were people who knew which captains they were, and there were slaves and free blacks in Norfolk who assisted others. So, and nobody knew, and the city fathers didn't even know who was doing this. That's the astonishing thing.
Well, living in Richmond, it was especially amazing to me that there's a ship called the City of Richmond that was leaving Richmond, which was the center of the slave trade in the Upper South. As Adam was saying, people escaping from this. You would have had that ship leaving few hundred yards
Right.
from the Lumpkins jail in the center of the slave trade. So I think as we imagine this, we don't imagine people, in the same way that people imagine people just being marched in coffles in slavery, they don't think about them being put on steamships and railroads. Neither do they imagine that the Underground Railroad was actually an above-ground railroad. A lot of the time, it's how Frederick Douglass escapes. So I thought one of the things that was so interesting, I'm with you, I'd like to know what happens below the Mason-Dixon line in this story. The glimpses we're able to get suggest the very sophisticated and constantly changing strategies. So in some ways, as the South became more and more modern, there were more ways to escape.
Right.
So Adam, the question is still what you would like to know.
There was an Onion article last week about historians alarmed at the relentless expansion of the past.
They keep making more of it.
It keeps getting bigger. That's a problem for us, but it keeps
Whereas the
us
future is
busy.
one day shorter each day.
Right, think about it.
Sorry.
Pessimist over there. I think, well, I'll say what I think we need to learn more about in a second, but I also want to emphasize that many enslaved people who set out on this journey to freedom did not make it.
Right.
This was an incredibly dangerous act to try to run away, to try to get to the north, to try to get to Canada. And there, if you read the stories, say in William Still's memoir, the stories that Professor Foner recounts in Gateway to Freedom, I mean, they're being chased all the way by bloodhounds and slave catchers, and every town that they enter presents new dangers. We talk about the risks that northern white abolitionists faced as agents of the Underground Railroad, and they did face dangers, but those dangers paled in comparison to the dangers and hazards that the fugitives themselves faced. So a very famous case of escape that failed was right here in Washington, D.C., 1848, I think, the case of the about 80 fugitives in Washington managed to get on board a ship called the Pearl. Basically they sort of got, what's the word? I'm not a sailor, but they ran becalmed at the mouth of the Chesapeake and were chased down and reclaimed, and many of them ended up sold. So we just have to remember that for all the stories of success and escape, there are also probably more stories of failure and heartache.
And once they reached the north, as Edna said, they weren't really safe either. In New York, there were slave catchers wandering the streets of New York City in this period. And according to the common law, a slave owner could just grab a slave and take him back. I mean, it was just your property. It was like you found your runaway horse or something, and you don't have to go to court to get your horse back. You just grab him. You can't cause a riot by doing it, but people were in danger of just being nabbed on the street, and especially after 1850. So that's why, as we said, they took off to Canada. The black population of New York City fell in is the only decade in our history where the black population of the city actually declined because people left because they were afraid of being sent back to slavery.
So, about the question of abolitionism and the coming of the Civil War, it suggests that things got worse before they got better. To Edna's point about that's kind of the fuel that fired this.
I think it just got more polarized.
Right.
The Underground Railroad, I think, was most active in the 1850s in defiance of this law. But the pro-slavery elements were also very active. So the situation became more and more, the irrepressible conflict got more and more polarized in the 1850s.
More and more irrepressible.
Yeah.
So Adam, you said you wanted to go ahead and say what you wish you knew more about.
Oh yes, my chance to attack.
Oh yeah, I've been waiting.
No, I would say that Gateway to Freedom is a wonderful reconstruction of the Underground Railroad on the eastern seaboard. But just because of the nature of the sources that Professor Foner was working with, it's a regional story. But there's also a kind of Underground Railroad, perhaps even not as well organized as on the eastern seaboard in what was then the Midwest and the West, the Mississippi Valley. And I think there's a wonderful book to be written about the Mississippi Valley route to freedom.
So what do you wish you still knew?
No, everything's been told.
Yeah, right. We'll see about that. I'm guessing the folks here have something else about that. Now, what do you wish? I mean,
No, I agree with Edna. I wish we knew more, wish I knew more about what happened below the Mason-Dixon line, where things were much less organized and where most fugitives just got random assistance. They would run into a free black person, or they would come by a farm and the slave would bring some food out to them in the woods. There wasn't anything planned, or it wasn't a station that they knew. You know, how this happened. There are stories like that in the book where people tell what happened, but you know, we really don't know nearly enough about what assistance was given to fugitives in the slave states themselves.
you know, to build on Adam's point, if you think about the numbers, so how many people do you guesstimate?
I guessed, well, I think about 100 a year passed through New York City, so that's 3,000 in the 30 years before the Civil War. Remember, there were 4 million slaves in 1860, but that's only one route. So let's say that 1,000 a year reached the North. That's a complete guess, but let's just say, so that's 30,000 in the, that's not insignificant, but it certainly is not, you know, destroying the institution of slavery.
Now, if we think about this very same place of the Upper South, Virginia, Maryland, around here, that is the seedbed for most of the people who managed to get on the Eastern Underground Railroad. 750, 850,000 people are sold from here to the Deep South in these same years. Right. So that's a scale for us to imagine that maybe 1 million people are forcibly shipped, marched, driven from here. So one of the things that I find people have a hard time imagining, that slavery and African American life before the Civil War in general was constantly on the move. And people imagine slavery as the absence of history. It's when nothing was happening to you. And instead, this book gives us a glimpse into the constant hope and dream of possibility that maybe this would be the day that we could escape. But more likely, it would be the day where your children would be sold away from you. Any day that you could wake up. So I think as we're putting the pieces together, interesting books have come out the last couple of years about sort of the dynamism of slavery. This is kind of the dynamism of escape from slavery. And I think you put all these pieces together and we're beginning to understand that there is a constant churning at the heart of this institution of slavery that I think that we're just now beginning to see in quite the same amount. So I'm getting ready to ask our colleagues here if they have questions, but I don't know if there's something else that you would like to say, or Edna or Adam, that you would, a question I should have asked? No? All right. So,
I want to mention one.
Yeah.
I want to put on the agenda here one person Adam knows who, Louis Napoleon.
Yes.
Who was a free black man, illiterate. He signed his little things with an X, but was a key operative in New York City, scouring the docks, meeting fugitives, taking them to a train to get up to upstate New York, and also going to court. Louis Napoleon, though illiterate, would get writs of habeas corpus if a slave has been recaptured to try to get them before a court. Obviously, it's a very resonant name. In one of these cases, the Lemon case, the attorney for Virginia asked, is this Louis Napoleon who brought this case the Emperor of France? And John Jay II, the lawyer who Edna mentioned, said, no, a much better man. So
it would have been a remarkable story if it had been, right?
Yeah.
So when you do ask the questions, we already have a leader who is ready for the microphones there. We ask you to go to that so everyone can hear your questions. So, yes, sir.
Hi, thank you. Maybe I'll change my mind after I read the book. I've always had this kind of cynical suspicion, though, that the Underground Railroad is one of those stories that people sort of overemphasize to make ourselves feel good, like the way people overemphasize the plot to assassinate Hitler or the Christmas truce in World War I, and it was really just a blip. So I guess my question is the Underground Railroad a fuse that set off abolitionist sparks, or was it just one of the sparks?
I think it is very possible to exaggerate the Underground Railroad. People have done it, but it was more than just a blip. I think certainly for the people who had helped to get to freedom, it was a very important thing. And whether it was 30,000, 20,000, some number is still an important number of people who achieved freedom with the help of other people, as we said, in a somewhat loosely organized set of networks. Now, I can understand why the Underground Railroad is popular. It's a popular subject of children's books. There's the Underground Railroad Center in Cincinnati. I think that's good. I think, especially, in a way, especially given what we've lived through in the last year of race relations in this country, the experience of black and white people working together, whatever their inner feelings about, they work together in a common cause to help people reach freedom. I think that's something to be proud of in our history. So I think it's good to study it and think about it as a model of that kind of cooperation being possible.
Yes, sir.
Yes, a couple of questions. One, I know this was referenced earlier, and I'm just curious if you can expand on it. Escape through the Mississippi Valley. Kentucky was a border state. Tennessee, maybe. And then, enslaved folks coming up through Mississippi. I'm just curious. I would think that there may have been whites who were not necessarily abolitionists in these areas, but they were possibly involved in anti-slavery. So I'm just curious about the research in that area, because I think that I would think that there is a lot more sympathy for folks being moved out of Tennessee and Kentucky into Indiana and Ohio. The other question I have is this. I'm an assistant curator at the National Postal Museum, and we're about to do a major exhibit. And one of the things that we found interesting was that in trying to acquire slave letters, we realized that there aren't that many slave letters out here on the open market. So we're just curious whether people, particularly people that own slaves, whites that own slaves, whether there was a sense of shame about the ownership of slaves and their family, and that whether or not these letters were destroyed, because there aren't that many on the market. And when they do come on the market, they're very expensive. So just wondering if perhaps if you can share some insight on that.
So two questions. One, Adam, you brought up the possibility of the Underground Railroad in the Midwest. Maybe you could talk about that. I heard sort of another question in that. Were there actually white allies in the South of folks? And he thought maybe they were more prevalent in the farther west than in the East. And then we'll talk about slave letters. So do you want to address that?
Okay. Well, certainly one of the most famous frontiers between slavery and freedom in the United States is the Ohio River. And of course, Uncle Tom's Cabin narrates the story of a slave who runs across the frozen Ohio from Kentucky to Ohio. In fact, William Still's journal describes a fugitive who comes into Philadelphia who says basically that he read Uncle Tom's Cabin and thought, why not me?
I'm not even carrying a baby, right?
Yeah. So Kentucky to Ohio was a fairly well-known crossing point. But also, there's some evidence that the steamboats that ran up and down the Mississippi River carried fugitive slaves. That was probably the principal avenue for escape for enslaved people who were really trapped, and they were trapped in the Deep South, trapped to a much greater extent than enslaved people in the Chesapeake. So laws were passed preventing steamboat captains from harboring stowaways, and so there's a consciousness that this might be going on. There are a lot of black workers along the river, and we know that some of them helped fugitive slaves escape. There's a famous story of William Wells Brown, who wrote his autobiography. He worked on steamboats. He worked on the Western steamboats and used his skills and talents as a steamboat man to ultimately escape, and he moved up to Buffalo. So there is a story there, but I don't think it's ever really been pieced together in the same way that Professor Foner
there
has
are
for
other
the Eastern
routes,
Seaboard.
too. I mean, there were slaves who escaped from Georgia to Florida, where the Seminole Indians gave them refuge before the Second Seminole
Mexico.
War. There, in Texas, slaves escaped to Mexico. Mexico was a refuge just like Canada. Mexico refused to send back escaped slaves from the U.S. just as Canada did. So if you were on the periphery, there were all sorts of different directions you might try.
Or near water. helps
Yeah.
a
Or
lot.
near water, right? If some slaves apprehended or took appropriated boats and went out to Bermuda. But if you were in the heart of the Deep South, in the Black Belt of Alabama, you didn't have a heck of a lot of opportunities there.
Right. You'd be better off running south to Mobile,
Or New
and trying to
Orleans,
get on a
right.
boat out to England than you would trying to go north.
That's one of the things about 12 Years a Slave evokes so powerfully, just how trapped
Yeah.
you were. You know? So do we think there were white Southerners who were helpful?
There were a few who pop up in my book. I don't think there were a heck of a lot. There were some.
And keep in mind, too, there's some Quakers in
Yeah.
the South as well. And
Right.
so they were more likely to get assistance from them. But if I could answer the
Yes, please
question
do.
about the letters,
Yes.
the slave letters, first of all, we have to remember that the majority of enslaved people were illiterate. They were not allowed to learn to read. Some did anyway, and some might have been able to dictate a letter to a sympathetic white person who then wrote the letter. But I don't think there would have been many of those letters anyway. We do know, I think, about most of them. I wouldn't be surprised, however, that there are letters lurking in someone's attic or whatever. I think that we don't always appreciate the history that we have right among us. And so we throw things out. Someone, may have had some kind of treasure trove and we just threw it out because we just saw it as junk. So the next time you're cleaning out grandmother's attic, you need to pay close attention to what's there, because that is how people find these things.
Some Eric Foner of the future might find it useful, right?
Let's hope. Yeah.
Something that just looked like a list to a lot of people.
Exactly.
Suddenly, in a different context, we can understand how it's meaningful. Great. Yes, sir.
Yes, I have a question for Professor Foner, which might be a bit of trivia. I don't know the answer to this, but Richard Riker, the city recorder, was Riker's Island named after him? He seemed to be quite
I
a
don't think
despicable
so.
character.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think Rikers Island was named earlier after some Dutch person.
Oh.
Yeah.
Richard Riker is in my book, who is a rather notorious judicial official in New York who collaborated with kidnappers who were picking blacks off the street and selling them into slavery or helping to get fugitive slaves. I don't think Rikers Island is named after Richard Riker. I hope not. If it is, we may try to change the name.
Then the other question for the panel as a whole, my notion of slaves escaping from bondage was always sort of influenced by this idea of following the North Star. But I don't see any real reference to following the North Star here. Where did that idea arise about following the North Star? And I don't know which side of the tree is, trying to see if there's moss on that side of the tree as you're escaping, what have you.
Trees on the north, the moss on the north side. I know that part. How about the rest of it? So why is and the title?
Nobody mentioned that to Sidney Howard Gay when he interviewed him. Nobody said anything about the North Star.
Yeah, but Frederick Douglass's newspaper's called the North Star, right?
Yes, and people presumably knew the North Star was toward the north, but it doesn't. I mean, there were fugitives in this who went the wrong way for a good while until somebody said, "Hey, you're going south. You're a fugitive slave. I think you better turn around and go the other direction." So Northrop talks about this in his memoir. He said, nobody knew how to. You think it's easy to just escape? I mean, where do you go? Once you're 5 miles away, you've never been there before. You don't know where the roads are going. It was very, as we've said, very, very difficult, very, very dangerous. So, people had just a kind of vague sense, and often somebody would give them a little advice or help, a sympathetic person, but often another person would apprehend them and, get them arrested.
A lot of times, if you're trying to get to a river, you need to go south to get north.
Right.
Yes, sir.
Hi, question for Professor Foner. What was the reaction of local political entities to having fugitives, Underground Railroad agents, and slave catchers in their territory, and I'm thinking particularly of Tammany Hall Democrats.
What was the political officials?
Yeah. What was the reaction?
Well, I think the reaction, it really varies from place to place. There were northern states that passed laws called the personal liberty laws that tried to obstruct the rendition of fugitive slaves. The fugitive slave issue is complicated because, as we said before, many people who are not abolitionists and not even anti-slavery really, when confronted with this on a human level, will have a different reaction. A person who's fleeing from slavery, you may be a complete believer in law and order, but you may, on a human level, want to help this person, and then the notion of slave owners coming into the North to grab people rubbed a lot of people the wrong way as time went on. But certainly, I think the Northern Democratic Party was very tied into the South, as Adam said, and so most Northern officials like that would be willing to cooperate in apprehending fugitive slaves. But then, there were others. In my book, I cite an instance where a policeman in New York City brought a fugitive to the office of Sidney Howard Gay and basically said, you better help this guy, because if you don't, he's going to be arrested in a few hours, Now, he's obviously not doing what he's supposed to do as a policeman, but just on a human level, he decided to help the guy.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Do we know how the slaves learned about sort of freedom? Not freedom as such, but that there was a free part of the United States, that there was Canada, you have the impression of slaves as being very isolated. They were prevented from reading and so on. And yet, obviously, at least some of them learned about all these things. So I'm sort of wondering how this happened.
That's an excellent question. An excellent question. Adam, you want to?
I think they learned it from their owners. The owners are running around railing against the fugitive slave law, complaining about all these abolitionists in the North. I think he's onto something. I really think that they, to a great extent, learned all of this from either directly from their owners or from the newspapers that their owners left lying around. And then,
Political
of course,
speeches that they were denouncing.
Right.
All these guys.
Yeah, the
a whole
enemy of my
region up
enemy
there.
is my friend.
But also
the basic
remember,
principle.
in Maryland particularly, half the black population was free by the 1850s. So they learned from free blacks, at least in the Upper South. There was freedom, there was the North, there was Canada. This information flowed around. They knew, a number of people who I cite knew that Quakers could help them. One guy got into Pennsylvania, knocked on the door of a house and said, "Send me to a Quaker. Can you tell me where a Quaker lives around here?" They had somehow heard. Or another said, if you meet a white guy who says thee and thou, you can trust him. So that kind of knowledge just sort of percolated around.
And there are black sailors as well who are
that's
coming
true.
into these port cities who are bringing all kinds of information. And so people are getting their knowledge from them as well.
And that's part of that image that we're understanding now of African-American life before the Civil War, that there's all this circulation of information and of knowledge and solidarity that we just weren't able to see before. Yes, sir.
We've mentioned Canada, quite a lot. I was curious, you've already said that the Canadian government said that they would not be sent back. Most of the refugees who ended up in Canada, did most of them stay there? Or did they come back? Did they wait until after the Civil War? What's the status?
A lot of them came back during the Civil War. Once it was pretty clear that they were not capturing fugitive slaves anymore in the North. Once, a good number came back. Some enlisted in the Union Army, men. But quite a few stayed there also. They had made homes, they had gotten jobs, and actually they had far more rights in Canada than they did in the northern United States. They could vote there. They could serve on juries. They had better job opportunities. And so, some came back, but a lot didn't, actually.
Yes.
So you all brought up techniques of how slaves were able to get to freedom. And my question is, what do you think was the best way for a slave to stay free?
To stay free or to get free?
Both.
Well, it depended upon where you were. If you were near a waterway, the most reasonable way perhaps would be to stow away on board a ship or a boat, or to take a boat, commandeer a boat, and just, get there. But once you were there, depending upon where you were, I mean, if you were, especially after 1850, if you are in Philadelphia or New York, you're not safe. So you have to go to Canada. And even once you're in Canada, you're not safe, because there are people who are pursuing fugitives into Canada as well. They're not supposed to be, but they certainly are doing that. There's some people who leave this area, and the area entirely, and they go to Europe. The lucky ones are doing that. So it's a very, very difficult thing to remain free once you've acquired that freedom, after 1850 at least.
One of the things that Professor Foner mentions in passing is that most of the people, the white people in the South who were railing against runaway slaves, thought they were running away to some place close to home, in a swamp or the woods, to the mountains, wherever they would. And so that's a tenuous kind of freedom, but it was a freedom that people were willing to risk their lives to get. But basically the answer is get as far away from slavery as you possibly can. But just because people couldn't escape to the north or Canada doesn't mean they didn't try to escape to whatever kind of freedom they could get. Yes?
Yes, when a lot of people think about slavery, a lot of people think that slaves were a monolithic group, but there were slaves who lived on large plantations, slaves who lived in small farms, maybe 10 or less people. There were house slaves. There were slaves who hired out, so there was a lot of diversity. There was a small number who were literate or semi-literate. There were some who were biracial. So the question is there a common demographic profile of a runaway slave? Or like, so for example, could we say that runaways tended not to be slaves who lived on large plantations, or maybe tended to be biracial or tended to be semi-literate? I mean, is there any information we have about what the average or what the most common runaway looked like or was?
Great question.
Well, I did this analysis of the 200 or so who are described in this record of fugitives, and yes, first of all, the large 75% of them were men. It was easier for, and most of them were fairly young. The average age was 25. They were young men in their 20s, but there were women. There were even young children, as you said, but it was easier for a young, strong guy like Frederick Douglass was when he ran away than an older person, obviously, or an infirm person. But these fugitives represented every single kind of slave you mentioned. There were people from plantations, from small farms, from cities. There were artisans. There were house servants, field hands, you name it. Every single kind of slave pops up in this thing. So the desire for freedom was not limited to any one particular demographic group in the slave community, but the physical ability, so to speak, to do it was presumably, it was a certain kind of people had that more than others.
And sometimes when these single men would send for their families as soon as they got there.
Right.
That kind of strategy as well. So we only have 8 more minutes, so all of us need to be disciplined to see if we can answer as many questions as we can. So yes, sir.
Hi, I had a historic puzzle piece I wanted to share with Professor Rothman and get your response to it. It went to your comment about, we have a regional study here with this book and how it'd be nice to go across and west. And this past summer, 150th anniversary, Gettysburg, the Lutheran Seminary up there opened up their cupola to the public, and they opened this fabulous museum. And they had a panel, and in it they were talking about Thaddeus Stevens and how he was in the Lincoln Museum. He was represented by Tommy Lee Jones, for folks, if you want to know who Thaddeus Stevens was. And in the movie, he had a common law black wife. And the thing that I found amazing was they said he represented the Gettysburg Congressional District, and he was very active in the Underground Railroad. And he later became a member of Congress and later became the Speaker of the House. So here goes to your point that it'd be nice to get a broader history of the Underground Railroad beyond just southeastern Pennsylvania. This is central to western Pennsylvania, a very noted American, and yet he was very active in the Underground Railroad. And I had one of those aha moments like, oh wow, it all sort of makes sense and all sort of comes together, but I had no idea that he was that active, but for this little panel in a museum. I just wanted to get your response to that.
Thank you.
As it turns out, that's an area that I've studied, and it's interesting to think about when they're recruiting the 54th Massachusetts. That area right on the border of south central Pennsylvania is one of the greatest producers of soldiers for that, because my guess is that, so they're 10 miles from
Yeah, that's
slavery.
what I was thinking.
But I'm guessing they're there for family, or so they go to fight. So I think you're right, is that same county would have abolitionists, but they would also have the most active slave catchers as well. I think there's something about the proximity to slavery that Eric was saying before over time, so it turns up the intensity on both sides. And so those same mountains that Thaddeus Stevens has as iron mines and kilns and so forth. Ironworks were also places that you could escape if you were enslaved. And so, but also a place where if you could escape, it would be good to have a white ally and a black ally. Okay? Yes.
The previous question was a perfect lead into mine. I wanted to know if you got a flavor for personality characteristics, certain strengths of character that were consistent among those who were attempting to escape, or at least among the 200 that you read about.
You know, personality is not so easy to judge from the kind of records that exist here. Some of them were very outspoken, for example, and as you mentioned about Hill, you know, sending these letters back. Some of them were very quiet and very hard to get information out of. I think it's more a question of just opportunity. People who somehow saw the opportunity to escape and felt there was a reasonable chance of success did it. And there were many, many others, I think, who would have liked to escape, but somehow the opportunity didn't arise, or they were fearful, or the policing system was too strong. So I'm not sure I would want to say the people who escaped had a particular personality trait which set them apart from everybody else. I think they had, for one reason or another, and every slave who escaped had his own story, they had greater opportunities than other people.
We may have only an opportunity for one more question. So,
all right. Go ahead.
Yes, sir.
One of you mentioned that in Maryland, for example, there was maybe 40 or 50% freedmen, I presume amongst other Africans coming through or in the state. I have a freedman that was in my family in the 1820s. It's difficult to find much information about him, but I am told that if you in fact were a freedman, you had to have what I've referred to the equivalent of a green card or some other identification. Is that, you obviously, several of you think that's correct. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
You had to have freedom papers. Okay. If you lived in a county, you had to go and register with that county. You had to indicate where you lived, what your occupation was. There was a free black registry in many of these states where your information was put down.
But
so
you had to carry it with you.
And you had to carry it, yes. And it could be stolen.
Yeah.
And you could be enslaved.
And you had to pay a fee to have it renewed every year. So I think green card is a good example of what it would be. Adam?
I just want to say that I've actually seen one here at the National Archives in a pension file of a widow of an African-American soldier from the Civil War. Included in that pension file was his free pass from the state of Louisiana.
Which seems a convenient way for me to point out the riches that the National Archives possesses. And the fact that kidding aside, that the Onion is right, we're making more history all the time. But the exciting thing about it is there are still so many discoveries, so many things that we need to know about this nation's history that this wonderful organization helps us to discover. And they help us discover by hosting discussions like this when you have exciting new books coming out. So I'd like to thank Adam and Edna and Professor Foner, and thank all of you for coming.
Thank you.
Okay, group shot.
Wait, how do I?
You pulls up.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Get that. Go ahead.
There you go.
Thank you, my
Oops,
man.
I'm sorry. That's the
All right.
bracket.
Well, thank you very
They,
much.
they,
It's great to see
they
you.
want a picture of us.
Oh, all right.